Hi everyone. So I was having a browse through YouTube the other day and actually came across one of my old training videos, for which I was a bit horrified because it wasn't posted by me, it was posted by someone else. And on top of that, it was actually an outdated video. So it gave me a bit of an idea because there's obviously a demand for stuff out there on the internet about procedural training on jet aircraft. So on this episode, we're going to talk about the ERJ 145 and more specifically, flying it procedurally. How do you actually use the flight guidance system? What sort of responses do you make on the flight mode annunciator or the FMA? And what we're going to do, we're going to depart, I say depart in inverted commas, Cape Town Airport. We'll route all the way to position octet on the standard instrument departure, and then return to Cape Town for the procedural ILS approach, runway 01. We'll get down to decision altitude, and then we will execute a go-round and follow the correct go-round actions and the published missed approach procedure. It's a nice little exercise, and hopefully at the end you have a good understanding of the flight guidance system and FMA on an ERJ 145. So when I learn, I like to use the simplest method possible. And I also like incorporating all the different ways we do learn. That's color, video, audio. So I've built this little document and I've called it Fly-By Numbers, because that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to make life as easy for ourselves as possible so that by the end of this exercise, we understand fully the flight guidance system and the flight mode annunciator of the ERJ 145. More specifically, what we're going to do on this exercise is we are going to depart runway 01 in Cape Town. We're going to comply with the octet 1 alpha departure, and we're going to climb all the way up to flight level 150, still talking to air traffic control and following all our normal procedures. Once we get to position octet, we are going to route back to Cape Town for a procedural ILS approach on runway 01. When we get to decision altitude, we'll execute a go-round following the correct go-round actions and the published missed approach procedure. The sim session itself has been built over quite a few years of experience. We've been fortunate here at SimAero to train lots of initial students from all around the world. And we use this exercise as the basis for all our training going forward. It's a wonderful exercise because at the end of the session, you should have a thorough understanding of the aircraft systems and the flight deck at least. And it does give you a lot of confidence for your simulator training. For us to be able to complete this exercise correctly, we need to have a good understanding of the aircraft systems inside the flight deck. The PFD and MFD go without saying. These are our foundation instruments, and in this session we're going to concentrate in particular on the flight mode annunciator, which is up over here. The flight guidance system is particularly important in this exercise. We will use this system, in fact, we will press the different modes on the system 36 times before we have finished the session. So by the time that the session is in fact over, we should have a very good understanding of this system. The radio management unit gets used a lot as well. We'll talk about something on this exercise a lot: sources and courses. Sources means what's the source of the radial. In other words, if we need to intercept a particular radial, just like we will in this exercise, after takeoff we need to turn left onto heading 330 to intercept the 354 radial Charlie Tango Victor. Now, for us to be able to make that intercept happen, we need to make sure that we've got the correct frequency, in this case 1157, set up on nav1. That would be the source. The correct course would be to have radial 354 set up. So when we talk about sources and courses, that is what we are talking about. It goes without saying that the center pedestal gets used quite a lot. Obviously, we are flying this aircraft as we would in a real-life situation. In particular, what we are concentrating on, because a lot of students haven't yet used or flown an aircraft with the FADEC system, so having the correct thrust mode select buttons pressed, there's a big emphasis on that, and a demonstration on the differences between all those modes. The display control panel also gets used. An anomaly on the ERJ is you cannot go from a raw data mode into an FMS mode without going to another lateral mode first. So, for an example, if we're on a particular radial in nav, so in other words on our FMA we have VRR in green, and we want to then use the FMS to route to a particular position, we will need to synchronize our heading bug first, select heading, which will get heading green on the FMA. We then come to our DCP panel. We can select FMS, and then we can go back to nav on the flight guidance system. That will then give us LNAV in green on the FMA. ICAS is an engine indication and crew alerting system. The ERJ 145 has this system built in. Therefore, we need to have an understanding of the system and how to utilize it correctly. After years flying with an ICAS system, I think I would find it quite difficult to go back to an aircraft that doesn't have this system. It provides us in the flight deck with a lot of information, and all we need to do is to utilize that information correctly. We don't want the ICAS system to be a hindrance to us in the flight deck or an extra bit of anxiety. We want it to actually help us. That's what it's designed to do. The only way it can help us is if we understand the system fully and understand what the ICAS system is trying to tell us. Departure will be Octet 1 Alpha for runway 01, and the routing reads on runway track to 3 DME, turn left 330 track, intercept Charlie Tango Victor radial 354 to 8 DME, turn right 060 track, intercept Romeo India Victor radial 090 to 22 DME, turn right to Octet, continue as per flight plan. Initial climb clearance is flight level 90. The arrival back into Cape Town will be for the procedural ILS approach runway 01. I'm not going to go through the entire chart, but important things to note: the localizer frequency 110.3, the final approach course is 009, glide slope checkout 1320 feet, and DA 344. Airport elevation is 151 feet, and we will be in this MSA 7,100 feet coming in from position Octet. We will route overhead the VRR at 3,000 feet, descend outbound on heading 189 to 2,000 feet, and then a left-hand turn heading 040 for the intercept heading for the ILS approach. On this part of the exercise, we'll concentrate on the airborne segment, the correct calls, the correct pronunciations, using the flight guidance system, when to call what, and what response we should make, either from the pilot flying or the pilot monitoring. Obviously, it's important here that there is a delegation of tasks. The pilot flying says certain things, the pilot monitoring says certain things. In this exercise, the pilot flying will be flying manually. Obviously, we want to improve your handling skills, particularly early on during your simulator training, so you'll be flying the aircraft without the autopilot. With that being said, it's the pilot monitoring that will be making the variance flight guidance system changes. However, the pilot flying still responds to the FMA changes. When the autopilot is engaged, obviously not below 1,000 foot, above 1,000 foot, then the pilot flying can make the various flight guidance system changes and the subsequent FMA callouts. However, in this scenario, it will be the pilot monitoring making those changes. So let's go ahead now and let's take it all the way from being on the runway. We can follow through on my little document that I've made over here. We're on the runway, pilot flying, check thrust, pilot monitoring, thrust set, and the call ATTCS green. There's an 80 knot check. The pilot monitoring obviously calls that, and the call is 80 knots. The response, check. That's followed by V1. Remember, at V1, captain's hand comes off the thrust lever, and the next call being rotate.
Okay, Bryan, we cleared for takeoff. You have control, feet on the brakes.
Control.
Releasing the park brake. Config
Takeoff.
test.
Okay.
Right, cleared for takeoff, your controls.
Okay,
Lights are
control. Check thrust.
My levers. ATTCS green. Thrust set. 80 knots.
Check.
V1, rotate.
The next call, and the most important call in this situation, positive climb. Why is that such an important call? Well, it's simple. Without the positive climb call, we will probably forget to call gear up, and the whole sequence of events then falls apart. That's why it's such a critical call, particularly in an abnormal situation, or a non-normal, I should say. When there's been an engine failure, we want to get that gear up as quickly as we can to improve the performance of the aircraft.
Positive climb.
Gear up.
Gear up. 400 feet.
Select heading.
Heading selected.
Heading green. At 400 feet AGL, the pilot monitoring will call 400 feet. Now I just want to stop there a second. Cape Town elevation is 151 feet. Therefore, 400 feet AGL will be 551 feet. So, at 550 feet, that's when the call will come 400 feet.
Acceleration altitude.
Climb sequence.
Climb sequence complete.
1,000 foot AGL, the pilot monitoring calls acceleration altitude. The response from the pilot flying is climb sequence.
Approaching 3 miles.
Check. Left 330.
Heading 330 set.
Arm nav.
Nav on.
VOR white. VOR green. Set heading to course. At 3DME, the pilot monitoring will call approaching 3DME. Something like that is obviously very good multi-crew cooperation because you are alerting the pilot flying as to what's coming next. The pilot flying will respond by saying left heading 330. Bearing in mind, we already have heading selected, so we don't need to re-engage heading mode on the flight guidance system. We are purely turning the heading knob to 330. The aircraft will then start to bank to the left. The pilot flying then calls for nav. Now, the correct source, Charlie Tango Victor, would have been set up while you were on the ground. So 1157 would have been set up in the nav window, and we have also set up radial 354 on our course bar. So all we need to do in this case is select nav, call VOR white. The pilot monitoring, if he picks it up or she picks it up in time, the call becomes radial alive. The pilot flying responds by check. VOR green, and the response becomes set heading to course. Now, VOR green is another way of saying the radial has been captured. So, on the 145, when a flight mode annunciator change happens, we call exactly what we see. There's no tricks here. You will see the letters VOR, and it will be in green, so we call VOR green. An important thing next is for the pilot flying to call set heading to course. The reason we do that, we don't want our heading bug still sitting on heading 330 and our course bar now on 354, that heading bug is useless to us. Although the heading mode is not engaged at this stage, we still want that bug on top of our course. It's good flight deck management and good flight deck etiquette. The next call from the pilot monitoring is approaching 8 DME. The pilot flying calls for select heading, the response heading green, and then right 060. We needed to go to heading mode again because we were on nav mode and the departure calls for us to turn on to a heading. So we select heading, we see heading green, we call heading green, we turn right onto 060 degrees, and we announce sources and courses. This is a little verbal cue that we do to make sure that we select the correct frequency on the RMU, and we also intercept the correct radial. So in this case, the pilot monitoring will set Romeo India Victor on both RMUs, always starting with the pilot flying first. We want to give the pilot flying the correct frequency first. We also want to set the correct course on his or her course bar. The pilot monitoring sets course 090 on both course bars. The pilot flying then calls for nav, which will be followed by VOR white. We then wait for a radial alive call, the response check, and then we will see VOR green. After that call, now we know, what do we say? Set heading to course. And we keep it standard like that all the time. It will always follow that sequence of events. Sources and courses to make sure we're intercepting the correct radial. After selecting nav, VOR will be illuminated in white, so we call VOR white. When it's captured, it will turn green, VOR green, and then we respond, set heading to course. Now we fly all the way to 22 DME. The pilot monitoring once again, approaching 22 DME. Pilot flying can select heading at this stage. Heading will go green. And we want to now route direct to position octet. So the pilot flying calls direct octet. That'll be on the flight management system. The pilot monitoring sets direct octet on the flight management system. The pilot monitoring selects nav on the DCP panel. The pilot flying calls for nav, and we will then see LNAV in green. Now I'm just going to stop there a sec and explain that part. We cannot go from a raw data source to a FMS source without going to heading mode in the middle. So we need to use our DCP for that. We are on raw data. We were on a radial all the way up to 22 DME. So by selecting heading, we'll go back into heading mode. We then can use our DCP to tell the system that we want to use the FMS. We press FMS. Once that is done, we can go back to nav on our flight guidance system, and by doing that, we will then see LNAV in green. We'll do exactly the same if we have to do that procedure in reverse.
Heading, course bar to FMS.
FMS.
Right.
And nav.
LNAV green. And we're approaching 22 miles, 22 octet. Heading to course.
Approaching flight level 150, Hazel White.
Jets.
Hazel Green.
Cruise thrust, 72.5% N1, will give us 250 knots.
When it becomes time to descent, of course we want to make sure that we can actually land at Cape Town, so we need to check the weather, we need to set the aircraft up with the applicable speeds, and we do that by putting the speeds in the multifunction display. That's explained in another exercise. But in other words, we need to make sure the aircraft is set up. We also have to brief correctly and paying special attention to the environment, any restrictions that you might have, and the weather. We also look at fuel. Alright, so to descend, we will first of all select a lower altitude on the ASIL, the altitude select. And when we do that, ASIL will come up in white. So, as we've seen so far, the call will become ASIL white. There's no tricks here. Whatever we see, we call. So to get the aircraft to descend, the pilot flying will select speed. The call will then be speed green. The pilot flying then sets the thrust to idle. The pilot flying then adjusts the speed to 210 knots or 250 knots. I always descend in a 3-in-1 profile, particularly for training. Make life easy for yourself. We know we want to be overhead Charlie Tango Victor at 3,000 feet. We're at 15,000 feet. Therefore, we got 12,000 feet to lose. 36 miles for me is a good time to start the descent. Your instructor will brief you as to what speed to descend at. You can descend 270 knots, 250 knots, or 210 knots. If we were at 250 knots and we wanted to slow down, let's say here at 15 miles to 210 knots, all we would do is set the speed to 210. We don't need to select speed again. We are already in that mode. So by adjusting the speed to 210, the nose of the aircraft will start to pitch up until we reach the desired speed, and then it will continue to descend at 210 knots. At 5 miles from Charlie Tango Victor, we want to slow down even more. We can call for flap 9. So the pilot flying says flap 9, and then after we have flap 9 selected, we can slow down to 180 knots. Again, simply by moving the speed bug to 180. When we are overhead Charlie Tango Victor, before the beacon, the pilot flying can select heading. That will give us heading green on the FMA. And then once we overhead Charlie Tango Victor, we just count for 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. And then we turn outbound onto heading 189. Once we're on that heading, we are now on the outbound leg of the approach. This is a good time where the pilot flying can actually brief your go-around actions and the subsequent missed approach procedure. Before 9 DME, sometime before, approximately, let's say 7 miles, you can select heading again. By pressing heading again, it'll actually put you into roll mode, keeping the wings level. Now by doing that, it frees up our heading bug so that we can set a nice intercept heading. So we always want to think ahead of the aircraft and be one step ahead. So in this case, by selecting heading again, we'll call roll green, and then we can use our heading bug to move on to 040. In this case will be our intercept heading. I've just got a note here. Pressing heading twice activates roll mode. At 9 DME, the pilot flying, all he or she needs to do now is select heading. And that will put the aircraft back into heading mode, and the aircraft will also roll onto the heading that we've already pre-selected. A very nice way of doing it. Don't forget to call heading green. And then again, important now, sources and courses. What do we have to do? Well, we've got to intercept the ILS. We would have been set up for all this already, 110.3 on both sides. That should have been in the standby. So the pilot monitoring activates 1103 on the pilot flying side, then 1103 on your own side, making sure 009 course bars are set on both sides. After that is done, the pilot flying says, arm the approach. After the approach is armed, we will see a localizer and glide slope in the color white. So the pilot flying calls localizer, glide slope white. The next call from the pilot monitoring, localizer alive. The pilot flying responds, check. Pilot monitoring's next call, localizer green. Pilot flying, set runway heading. This is very important to get that sequence of events right. At this stage, it's a high tension part of the flight. You're intercepting an ILS for an approach, so there's no real room for error. We need to make sure that those calls are 100% correct. The next call from the pilot monitoring, glide slope alive. Pilot flying, check. At 1.5 dots above the glide slope, the pilot monitoring calls 1.5 dots. The response from the pilot flying, gear down, flap 22, speed 140. And we do that as one call. We don't wait for the pilot monitoring to do each of those things individually. We call it as one call. Gear down, flap 22, speed 140. At this point, be very cautious or be very wary about selecting speed mode again. That's not what the pilot flying is calling for. The pilot flying is calling for setting on the bug a speed of 140. If you select speed in that situation, it will take the approach arm away, which is what we don't want. So be very cautious to not press speed mode in that situation. We purely want the speed set on the speed bug. When the glide slope is captured, it will turn green. So glide slope green, pilot flying, set missed approach altitude. This is an important call because it's the only time we can get our missed approach altitude set. And on interception of the glide slope is the best time to set your missed approach altitude. So those calls there are critical as well. Glide slope green, set missed approach altitude set. After the glide slope has been captured and your speed is below 145 knots, the pilot flying can call for flap 45, speed 135 or 133, whatever your approach speed is for that particular weight on that particular day. After that is done, pilot flying calls for before landing checklist. Once that is complete, the approach can of course continue, and you will get to a point either at decision altitude or above where the instructor says, Sim Trainer 1, go around. So the response from the pilot flying, let's verbalize that we've heard it and we're actually taking action. So the response is going around. You'll click the toga button, advance the thrust levers all the way into to the stop, rotate into the wing bars and call for flap 9, positive climb, gear up, 400 foot, heading. Alright, let's go through that slowly. Going around, go around thrust, flap 9. The next call comes from the pilot monitoring, positive climb. Again, a critical call. If you forget that call, we will more than likely forget to put the gear up as well. So, positive climb, gear up. We wait till 400 foot AGL. At 400 foot, we select heading, and we will see on the FMA heading in green, so we call heading green. Well, I really hoped you enjoyed that exercise, flying by numbers, the ERJ 145. Flying is all about procedures and knowing your systems. The only way we can operate effectively is by knowing those in detail. This was all about a little introductory understanding of the flight guidance system and FMA. If you have any questions or would like to know about training here at Summarised, please don't hesitate to give me a shout. I'm more than happy to assist you with any of your training needs. Keep the blue side up and fly safely. From my side, I'll say cheers for now.